welcoming me into your church. I appreciate it. I didn't know the choir was this good. If I have to compete with them, I'm in trouble. When I went back and thought about the things I went through and experienced, oftentimes I block them out to get through day-to-day life. So when I did recall some of these things, memory after memory was popping up, but I'm doing my best to keep it short and sweet, because my grandfather had a saying: show up to be seen, show up to be seen, speak up to be heard, and sit down to be appreciated. I am from Erie, born and raised. I went to East High School. After the end of my senior year, I didn't want to take any more schooling. I was tired of school, so I wanted to do something different. And as he said, I signed up in August of '01. A month later, my brother and I were on a landscaping job, and we got in the truck, and on every radio station known to man, they were covering the 9/11, the towers getting hit. And my brother was a loadmaster who got out, and he looked at me and he said, "You're going to war, buddy." So I remember back then I wanted some revenge. I wanted some get back for what they did to us. That's how I felt in the beginning. I served 6 tours in a 3-year period. The first year, of course, was boot camp and a lot of academic training. Over the course of my 4 years, I had 1,400 hours in the air. I flew with the plane, and 3/4 of that is combat. I had to go through water survival, POW training, land survival, a bunch of training. And looking back on it, when I asked myself, when did I first start praying to God, was when I entered this academic training that had a 75% washout rate. 75% got washed out. They couldn't keep up with the academics. And I failed my first 2 tests. And I remember going up to the instructor, and he said, "Charlie, pick another job, become a security police." And I said, "I can't." And he said, "Well, you have to." So that night I got with the smartest kid in the class, and my mother told me, "Just pray, hon, pray." So I prayed, and the next 8 tests, I got an A on every one of them. Going overseas, my first time, I was 19 years old. The pilot let me fly the plane for a couple seconds, and then I felt much safer with him behind the controls. We landed in Trapani, Sicily without clearance. I think the navigator screwed up or something. So we landed in Trapani, Sicily, and they didn't know or want us there. And they surrounded the plane with guns, and we had to take out our guns. And looking back, that was my first lesson in not remaining complacent. I went to Jacobabad, Pakistan for my first deployment. The average temperature, I think, is 140 degrees. So if you think you were hot today, just imagine Jacobabad. When I returned from that first deployment after 60 days, I remember hitting the ground on the runway, and we're traveling down the runway, and my sergeant was on the phone, and he hung up, and he said, "Harkins, keep your bags packed. You're going back in 48 hours. So that's how it was oftentimes. It was back and forth, back and forth. I called my girlfriend at the time of 8 years off and on. She flew down immediately, but then I never saw her again. So that was one of the sacrifices I made. And the pastor asked me what was the hardest thing. I'll get into that a little later, but on the drive in here, I was realizing the hardest thing was when I lost her, getting up every day and completing the missions without somebody as a moral support as she was. That was the toughest thing. I remember I wasn't shaving. I didn't care. I would go to the gym to work out and fall asleep on the weight bench. I just didn't have that drive or spirit. I was 19, and I would be flying over fires that Saddam set on fire, and I would see these like 500 feet in the air with camels running. And before we went in there and dropped bombs after bomb on Iraq, the original plan was to do a mass troop drop, the biggest troop drop since World War I. And we got briefed in a room with about 10 of us that the first plane going in is going to be safe, but the rest of you guys are going to be target practice. So you're going to see limbs flying off and bodies something right, and that was the reality of what we were looking at. Then days later, they called and canceled that order, and that's when we did the bombing. I remember banking over Saddam Hussein's palace every other day, just looking down at it. He had a big pool and a palace, and everything else was dirt poor, just going down the slope. He was at the top of his peak in a palace. A couple of close calls. I was in Kuwait starting engines, and I was clearing the engines for the pilot so we could roar up the engines and take off. And the alarm red started sounding around us. Alarm red, seek shelter. And it was what we trained for, but it still throws you off when you hear that. And I ran up in the cockpit, and the pilots are educated, so they got their notebooks and pencils, and they're like, okay, here's what we're going to do first. And me and this other guy grabbed each other and just took off running for the bomb shelters. And we were in there fixing each other up, making sure we were set for chemical warfare. And it turned out later that night on CNN, I turned it on, and our Patriot missiles shot those missiles down in the air. And seeing that on CNN, 19 years old, that's when I realized that I'm in the war. You know, it was a reality check. One of the hardest things for me towards the end of these deployments was when I didn't believe in the mission, when I didn't believe in the reasons of why we were there, getting up every day and doing the missions. That was tough to get that drive and that spirit. I remember calling on my father, and he said, well, don't be there for your higher-ups and the president if you don't agree with everything. Be there for your troops. Be there for your brothers. Be there to help the next guy. So that was something I always held on to keep me going through the end. I also remember sitting outside early in the morning before our missions would take place, and you could hear these mystical chants from the Muslims when they were praying. And the sun was coming up, it was 5 a.m., and most people would be asleep, but I would just sit outside and listen to it. I found it very mystical, and it reminded me that these are humans just like us. They're not some machine that we've trained our minds to think they are, or they're pure evil. These are people who have a faith just like us. If not, in some situations, more of a faith. They pray 5 times a day, devoted, and I just found that very mystical. And they rely on their faith. After their prayer is over, they rely on their faith to get them through the day. We rely on intelligence briefings, the sharpest bombs, you know, the best technology. It was always interesting calling my mom and dad when I was overseas. They were 2 different people, and I would call my dad, or I should call my mom, and you know, it'd be a day that I got shot at or something, and I would say, oh, Mom, you're not going to believe what happened today. And she was, honey, if it's bad, I don't want to hear it. And that's how she was. And then I would call my dad, and I would say, Dad, I got shot at today. Like, they're really shooting at us. And he would say, yeah, Char, hey, you tell your higher-ups we're shooting at the wrong people. I got this Sprint bill from AT&T. It's $155. So I'd hang up the phone and laugh and remember that there is another world going on the other side of the world. But looking back on it, what made me most proud about my time in the service was being sent to Hurricane Katrina to help our own people. Over there, it just didn't feel like we were getting anything done. We could do 110 missions, but they still didn't want us there. They still would shoot at us. So it felt good going down to Hurricane Katrina to see these people who had nothing but the clothes on their back and fight to see another day and be happy that we were there to help. I remember that's all our crew wanted to do was go down there and help out. After returning home from my last deployment, I wrote this down because the smell of fresh cut grass. I remember being in the desert for that long, you got sand all over you. I remember hanging out the taxi window in Greece and just smelling the fresh air and the grass cut. The taxi driver must have thought I was crazy, but I couldn't get enough of the smell of the fresh cut grass. My perspective on life, I think, changed and my psyche did too, for having to be aware all the time and never at ease, never resting, to always have to be watching for a missile or a bullet coming at me. But I remember coming home, and one of the things that bothered me would be going to the mall and seeing a 14-year-old girl cussing her mother out because she didn't have the newest smartphone or whatever cell phone was out then. When over there was kids drinking out of mud puddles and were complacent, satisfied, and happy with it, and they didn't know any better. Over there, we had each other's backs. There was a brotherhood, a sense of if you slip, I'll pick you up. Remember one time I got shot at, and the pilot related to an AC-130. Within minutes, it just sounded like the earth was crumbling, and I said, "What is that noise?" And he said, "They're leveling the mountain that just shot at us." So somebody shot at us, and then they took out that whole mountain. Then you come over here, and they won't tell you if you got food in your teeth. Coming home, it was difficult to adjust. No more steady checks, no more 3 hot meals. In 2006, I got out in 2005. In 2006, I was drinking heavily, which a lot of military people do as an escape, and it caught up with me. I had a DUI, and I hit into the side of an ambulance, and I was uninsured, I was drunk, and it cost me a lot. I remember I was so distraught from that, and I felt Jesus pulling on me around that time. This was a big moment in my faith. I remember sitting there crying, and I was praying, and I said, "God, please, I just pray you guide me and direct me on the path I need to be." And then I reached for the Bible, and I opened it up to Psalms, I believe it's 34 or 32, and it said, "My son, I will guide you and direct you with my eye upon you." And that's when I dropped the Bible, and I could feel just a rush through me and a sense of comfort and clarity. And I looked up and I said, "I'm on your team." But that's also when a lot of the battles began between what was in my mind and what was in my soul. Lack of self-worth, being always on guard, unable to relax. What I mean by lack of self-worth is when you're over there, you got a uniform on for America, everyone looks up to you, you're a role model. But when you come home and that uniform comes off, no one knows who you are. You're just an average Joe, and you don't feel a sense of duty or a sense of mission. So I did things I wasn't proud of. I hung around drug dealers, I sold drugs, I used drugs to a point where it just brought me very, very, very low. It got so bad that about 1.5 years ago, I called the Erie VA, and I threw up my arms. I said, "I need some help. I'm a veteran who's been through it, and I give up. I don't even know if I want to live anymore. That's how bad it is." And they sent somebody out. His name is Marty Acree, and he sat with me, and he looked around, and he said, "You got some demons you got to face, but you got some work to put in, but we'll get you out of here." So that's when I became homeless. I left the apartment I was in because I couldn't afford it. I was never paying. I think the landlord just liked me and looked out for me, maybe because I was a veteran, and I didn't want that anymore. I wanted my life back and to be in control. And I didn't want my parents to take care of me. I was too old for that. So I decided I'm going to go into the homeless shelters. Then I'm going to go into this Liberty House, which takes care of homeless vets. So it's on my own. They're helping me, but I don't have my parents housing me, roofing me, feeding me. At this Liberty House, I met a guy named Stephen Durant, who's here today. And I can't say enough about him. He taught me a lot, many things. Above all, it's okay to not be okay. He accepted me as I was, never judged me, just picked me up from the ground up, and I put in the work, but he was always there to help me. I look bad. Right now I'm about 192, and I weighed about 148. Any fans of The Walking Dead in here? That's what I look like. The advice I would give someone heading into war today would be to establish some type of faith or higher power, pray to and call upon for faith, guidance, and strength. Because once our mind gives up or plays tricks on us, we become emotionally drained, and this becomes necessary to continue the missions and be successful in the military. So I believe faith is very necessary for someone going into the service or a higher power. People I looked up to as Steve and a pilot I used to have, who I both look at as spiritual mentors, would always tell me, "Oh, you made it by the grace of God," or "You have God's grace." And I never knew what that meant. Like, what do I move graceful like a ballerina? So I looked it up and I had to study it. God shows both mercy and grace, but they are not the same. Mercy withholds punishment we deserve, as Jesus canceled our sin debt to sacrifice his perfect Son in our place. Grace, which comes from the Greek word charis, means favor, blessing, or kindness. Grace is choosing to bless us rather than curse us as our sins deserve. I believe God has given me grace by first returning me home safely from the war, in the midst of war, keeping me out of harm's reach from missiles, bullets, etc. Going from homeless to having my own apartment, from walking for years to owning my own car, from drowning in drugs to today being 1 year, 2 months, and some change sober in a successful recovery, and from being unemployed for years to being today a federal employee full-time at the Erie VA. God has indeed given me both grace with his blessing and his mercy. Lastly, I wish we in other countries could exhaust the ideas of trying to get along with each other as much as we look for opportunities to build bigger, shinier bombs to destroy one another, and have the nerve to say, "In the name of God," as we do it. Nothing about God, to my understanding, preaches to destroy one another, but rather to love one another. No matter how hard it might be, no matter how big the differences are between us or the distance, or even the God which we pray to. I would also like to acknowledge the parents, mothers, fathers who had children overseas, because they're just as much as military family as the servicemen who served. Many of them had to sacrifice their own children, which I can't imagine. Thanks to my mom for always writing me every day when I was over there. I'll never forget that. I don't want to get choked up, so I'm going to keep moving. Thank you to my dad for helping me get back on my feet and believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. When I got out of the state I was in, I went to my dad's for a couple days before I hit the homeless shelter, and he would tell me, "Just look at the homeless shelter like you're writing a paper. Look at it from a different perspective." And I said, "I just don't believe in myself." And he said, "That's okay. I'm going to be here until you do." And that's when I broke down and we hugged and cried. Thank you to Steve, my mentor, for aiding me in my recovery and helping me utilize what I have to be successful, and teaching me it's not okay to be okay. But I'm okay now. One thing I found interesting I saw today is I'd like to end with is, over this holiday, I think we should ask ourselves if we are Americans with a pinch of Christian flavor, or are we Christians with a pinch of American flavor? And this is the part where I have to sit down and be appreciated.